The dust-laden wind carried the wretched sound of coughing through the open window as Grace Campbell stepped down from the stagecoach, her worn leather valise clutched in her trembling hand, and a letter of arrangement folded neatly in her pocket, a marriage contract to a man she'd never met, a man who was already halfway to his grave. The journey from Boston to Lone Pine, California, had taken weeks, each mile carrying her farther from the life she'd known and closer to an uncertain future. It was June of 1878, and at 23 years old, Grace had already weathered the loss of her parents to influenza and the foreclosure of their modest family home. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like Providence, a wealthy rancher seeking a bride to care for him in his final days, offering security and inheritance in exchange. Miss Campbell. A tall figure approached as she surveyed the dusty main street of Lone Pine, a settlement nestled between the towering Sierra Nevada mountains and the sprawling expanse of desert. "Yes," she replied, squinting against the harsh California sunlight. "I'm Grace Campbell." The man before her removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached brown hair and eyes the color of weathered leather. His face was tanned and lined from years under the open sky, his posture straight and confident despite the trail dust on his clothes. He wasn't the dying man she'd come to marry. This man was all strength and vitality. "Zeke Armstrong," he introduced himself with a curt nod. "Foreman of the Broken Spur. Mr. Harrington sent me to collect you." His gaze swept over her, taking in the simple navy traveling dress, the practical boots just visible beneath her hem, and the determined set of her jaw. Whatever assessment he made, he kept to himself, merely extending a calloused hand for her valise. "Is it far?" she asked, relinquishing the bag to him. "About an hour by wagon," Zeke replied, gesturing toward a sturdy buckboard parked at the end of the street. "Mr. Harrington wanted to come himself, but he had a bad spell this morning." Grace nodded, a flutter of anxiety rising in her chest. She'd known what she was agreeing to, but the reality of marrying a dying stranger was now imminent. "How is he today?" Something flickered across Zeke's face, pity perhaps, or resignation. "Not good, madam, not good at all." As they walked to the wagon, Grace felt the weight of stares from the townsfolk. A new woman in town was cause enough for interest, but word had likely spread about her arrangement with Edward Harrington, the owner of one of the largest cattle ranches in the eastern Sierra. Zeke helped her onto the seat before climbing up beside her and taking the reins. The horses set off at a steady pace, leaving the town behind and heading east toward the mountains. "Mr. Harrington told me you're from Boston," Zeke said after several minutes of silence, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Yes," Grace replied. "My whole life until now. That's quite a change. Lone Pine ain't exactly Boston." A small smile touched her lips. "I gathered that much already." "What made you answer his advertisement?" Zeke asked, his tone carefully neutral. "If you don't mind my asking." Grace considered the question. The truth was complicated desperation, necessity, a desire to escape crushing debt and potentially worse fates for a woman alone in Boston. But the simple version would suffice. "I needed a fresh start," she said, "and Mr. Harrington needed someone to care for him." Zeke nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "He's a good man. Built that ranch from nothing after the war. Would have kept building it too if the consumption hadn't got hold of him." The mention of tuberculosis made Grace's throat tighten. She'd seen what the disease could do, how it consumed a person from the inside out, leaving them hollow-eyed and gasping. Yet she'd agreed to bind herself to a man suffering its cruelties, to care for him until death released them both. "How long does he have?" she asked quietly. Zeke's hands tightened on the reins. "Doc says a few months at most, could be weeks." He turned to look at her then, his expression grave. "You should know what you're walking into. It ain't pretty at the end." "I know," she said simply. "I've seen it before." The road took them through rolling grasslands that gave way to scattered pine forests as they climbed higher. Cattle dotted the hillsides, the broken spur brand visible on their flanks. In the distance, a group of riders moved a small herd across a meadow. "That's part of our summer grazing land," Zeke explained, following her gaze. "Best grass in the county." Edward Mr. Harrington, he knew what he was doing when he bought this land. "It's beautiful," Grace admitted, taking in the vista of mountains and valleys. Despite her circumstances, she could appreciate the wild grandeur of this place, so different from the crowded streets of Boston. As they crested a rise, the ranch came into view, a sprawling main house built of sturdy logs and stone, surrounded by barns, corrals, and bunkhouses. It was larger and more impressive than Grace had imagined, speaking to the wealth and success Edward Harrington had accumulated. "Home," Zeke said simply, guiding the horses down the slope toward the ranch. As they approached, Grace noticed a figure on the wide porch of the main house, a man seated in a rocking chair, wrapped in blankets despite the warm June day. Even from a distance, she could see how thin he was, how the illness had whittled him down. "That's him," Zeke said unnecessarily. "He insisted on waiting outside to greet you properly." Grace straightened her back and smoothed her skirts, preparing herself for the meeting. This was to be her husband, this stranger whose life was slipping away with each labored breath. She wondered if she would feel anything for him beyond pity, if there could be any genuine affection in such an arrangement. Zeke brought the wagon to a halt in front of the house and jumped down, coming around to help Grace descend. As her feet touched the ground, she looked up to meet the gaze of Edward Harrington. His face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin, but his eyes were clear and intelligent. "Miss Campbell," he called, his voice stronger than she'd expected. "Welcome to the Broken Spur." Grace gathered her courage and approached the porch steps, aware of Zeke's presence just behind her. "Mr. Harrington, thank you for your welcome." The dying man's lips curved in a smile. "Please call me Edward. After all, we're to be married tomorrow, God willing." He extended a thin hand toward her. "And I'd like to know my bride a little before I go." As Grace took his hand, she was struck by the contrast, his skin cool and papery against hers, the bones prominent beneath. Yet there was dignity in his bearing, a stubborn resistance to the disease ravaging him. "I'd like that too," she replied honestly. "And please call me Grace." Edward nodded, then a coughing fit seized him, his body convulsing with the force of it. Zeke moved quickly, supporting the older man and offering a handkerchief that came away spotted with blood. When the spell passed, Edward sagged back in his chair, exhausted. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Not the first impression I hoped to make." "There's nothing to forgive," Grace assured him, though the sight had shaken her. Edward's gaze shifted to Zeke. "Show Miss Campbell to her room, would you? She must be tired from her journey. We can talk more at supper if I'm able." Zeke nodded, picking up Grace's valise again. "This way, madam." As they entered the house, Grace was struck by the unexpected refinement of the interior. The furniture was solid and well made, the floors covered with colorful rugs, and landscape paintings adorned the walls. It wasn't what she'd expected from a bachelor rancher in the West. "My late wife had a hand in the decorating," Edward called from behind them, having followed with slow, careful steps. "Catherine had good taste." Grace turned, surprised. "I didn't know you were widowed." 7 years now," Edward confirmed, lowering himself carefully into an armchair by the fireplace. "Childbirth took her and our daughter." His expression clouded with old grief. "I never remarried, didn't see the point until this." He gestured vaguely at his chest, where the disease lurked. Zeke cleared his throat. "I'll take your bag upstairs, Miss Campbell, first door on the right. The bathroom's at the end of the hall if you'd like to freshen up." After he'd gone, Grace took a seat across from Edward, unsure what to say. The man she'd agreed to marry was watching her with a thoughtful expression. "You're wondering if you've made a terrible mistake," he said finally, a hint of wry humor in his voice. Grace couldn't help but smile. "The thought did cross my mind on the journey here. I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to turn right around and go back east. This isn't what most young women dream of." He paused, studying her. "But something tells me you're not most young women." "No," she agreed. "I'm not." After a moment's hesitation, she added, "My parents died last year. There was debt I didn't know about. The house was sold to pay it, and I was left with very little." Edward nodded slowly. "So you answered the advertisement of a dying man, trading your care for security." "It sounds cold when you put it that way," Grace said, uncomfortable with the blunt assessment. "Not cold, practical." Edward's eyes crinkled at the corners. "I need someone to care for me, yes, but also someone who'll inherit this place when I'm gone, someone who appreciates what I've built here." Grace frowned slightly. "You have no family, no one who expected to inherit." A shadow passed over Edward's face. "A nephew in San Francisco who hasn't visited in 5 years. He'd sell this place without a second thought." He leaned forward, suddenly intent. "I don't want that, Grace. This land, these people who work for me, they deserve better than to be cast aside for quick profit." "And you think I'll do better by them?" she asked. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." Edward sat back, another cough threatening. "Your letters showed character, and I trust Zeke's judgment. He's been running this place in all but name for the past year. If he thinks you shouldn't stay after I'm gone, I'll make other arrangements." Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced Zeke's return. He paused in the doorway, looking between them. "Everything all right?" "Just getting acquainted," Edward replied. "Zeke, would you ask Mrs. Flores to prepare some tea? And perhaps Grace would like something to eat after her journey." As Zeke departed for the kitchen, Grace considered the situation she'd walked into. The dying man before her seemed decent enough, honest about his motivations. But it was the other man, the foreman with the watchful eyes, whose judgment would apparently determine her future here. "You rely on him a great deal," she observed. "Zeke," Edward smiled. "He's been with me 15 years. Started as a ranch hand at 18, worked his way up to foreman by 25. I'd have been dead already without him taking over when I got sick. He seems capable. He's the best cowman in 3 counties and smart as any college man I've met." Edward's expression grew serious. "When I'm gone, you'll need him, Grace. Whatever you decide to do with this place." Grace nodded slowly, understanding the implicit message. Her position here would depend on forging a working relationship with the taciturn foreman. "I should let you rest before supper," she said, rising from her chair. "The journey was long, and I'd like to wash off the travel dust." Edward nodded, already looking tired. "Mrs. Flores will call you when the meal is ready. She's our housekeeper and cook, been with me almost as long as Zeke." Grace made her way upstairs to the room Zeke had indicated. It was larger than she'd expected, with a 4-poster bed draped in a colorful quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a wardrobe of polished wood. Someone had placed a vase of wildflowers on the dresser, a thoughtful touch she hadn't anticipated. Her valise sat at the foot of the bed, and she unpacked her meager belongings: 3 dresses besides the one she wore, undergarments, a nightgown, a few personal items, and a small leather-bound Bible that had belonged to her mother. Everything she owned in the world, fitting easily into a single bag. Tomorrow, she would marry Edward Harrington, becoming mistress of the Broken Spur Ranch and caretaker to its dying owner. And then, if Zeke Armstrong deemed her worthy, she might stay after Edward was gone, inheriting a life she'd never imagined for herself. Grace poured water from the pitcher into the basin and began to wash her face, wondering what judgment the foreman would pass on her. and why the thought made her heart beat faster than it should. The next morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the curtains as Grace dressed for her wedding. She wore her best dress, a dove gray silk with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs, originally made for her mother's funeral and repurposed for this solemn occasion. A knock at the door revealed Mrs. Flores, a sturdy woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and kind eyes. "The minister is here, Miss Campbell. Mr. Harrington is waiting in the parlor when you're ready." "Thank you," Grace replied, her hands smoothing the fabric of her dress nervously. "I'll be down in a moment." When Mrs. Flores had gone, Grace took a deep breath and looked at herself in the mirror. She appeared calm on the outside, but inside, a storm of emotions swirled: uncertainty, resignation, and an odd sense of determination. This wasn't the marriage she'd once dreamed of, but it was the path she'd chosen, and she would walk it with dignity. Downstairs, she found Edward seated in an armchair, dressed in a suit that hung loosely on his frame. The minister from Lone Pine stood nearby, Bible in hand, while Zeke and Mrs. Flores waited as witnesses. Edward brightened visibly when she entered, struggling to rise. "Please don't stand," Grace said quickly, crossing to his side. "Save your strength." Edward took her hand, his touch feather light. "You look lovely, Grace." The ceremony was brief and simple, the traditional vows slightly modified to omit, "Until death do us part," a phrase too imminent to bear saying. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Edward kissed her hand gently, and Grace felt a rush of compassion for this man who faced death with such dignity. "Mrs. Harrington," Zeke said afterward, the new name sounding strange to her ears. "Congratulations." His expression was unreadable as he offered a formal bow. "Thank you, Mr. Armstrong," she replied, equally formal. Mrs. Flores had prepared a small wedding breakfast, and they gathered around the dining table while Edward picked at his food, clearly making an effort for Grace's sake. The conversation was stilted at first, but gradually eased as they discussed the ranch and its operations. "I'd like to show Grace around tomorrow," Edward told Zeke, "if the weather holds and I'm strong enough." Zeke nodded. "I can hitch up the light buggy. It'll be easier on you than the buckboard." "Good. She should see what she's inherited." Edward smiled at Grace, but the effort triggered another coughing fit, worse than the day before. This time, blood flecked not just the handkerchief but his lips and chin. Grace moved quickly, supporting him while Zeke went for the medicine the doctor had left. When the attack finally subsided, Edward was gray-faced and trembling. "I believe I need to rest," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Zeke and Grace helped him to his bedroom, where she settled him against the pillows while Zeke measured out drops from a brown bottle. "Laudanum," Zeke explained quietly, "for the pain and cough." After Edward had taken the medicine and drifted into an uneasy sleep, Grace followed Zeke into the hallway. "Is it always this bad?" "Some days are better than others," he answered, "but they're getting fewer." He hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry your wedding day turned out like this." "It's not your fault," Grace said, "nor his." She glanced back at the closed door. "I knew what I was agreeing to." "Still," Zeke said, his eyes meeting hers directly for perhaps the first time, "it's a hard thing you've taken on. Most wouldn't have the stomach for it." Grace lifted her chin. "I'm not most people, Mr. Armstrong." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, madam, I'm beginning to see that." The tour Edward had planned never materialized. The day after the wedding, he was too weak to rise, and by the third day the doctor was called from town. "The disease is advancing rapidly now," Dr. Miller told Grace and Zeke in hushed tones outside Edward's room. "I've seen this pattern before. The decline can be swift at the end." "How long?" Zeke asked, his face grim. The doctor shook his head. "Days, perhaps. A week at most, I'd say." Grace felt a complex surge of emotion: sadness for Edward's suffering, anxiety about her own future, and an odd guilt that she'd known her husband for so little time before he would be taken. "Is there nothing more we can do?" she asked. "Keep him comfortable. Give him the laudanum when the pain is bad." The doctor placed a sympathetic hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrington, truly." After he'd gone, Grace turned to find Zeke watching her with that assessing gaze. "You should get some rest," he said. "I'll sit with him for a while." "No," she replied firmly. "He's my husband. I'll stay." For the next 3 days, Grace barely left Edward's bedside, sleeping in snatches on a chair beside him, bathing his fevered brow and helping him sip water when he was lucid. Zeke came and went, managing the ranch but returning frequently to check on them both. On the fourth night, during a rare moment of clarity, Edward beckoned Zeke close to his bed where Grace already sat. "Both of you," he whispered hoarsely. "Need to talk." Grace took his hand gently while Zeke stood at the foot of the bed, his hat in his hands. "Grace," Edward began, each word an effort, "you've been more than I deserved, thank you." "Don't talk that way," she said. "Save your strength." He shook his head slightly. "No time for that now." His gaze shifted to Zeke. "The will is in my desk. Grace gets everything as we agreed, but Zeke—" "I'm here, boss," the foreman said, moving closer. "Tell her, after I'm gone." Edward's fingers tightened weakly around Grace's. She should stay. Zeke's expression remained steady, but something flickered in his eyes. "I will, promise me," Edward insisted, a sudden urgency in his voice. "I promise," Zeke said solemnly. Edward seemed to relax then, sinking back against the pillows. "Good, good." His eyes drifted closed. "You too. We'll manage together." Grace looked up at Zeke, a question in her eyes, but he merely shook his head slightly. "Not now." Edward slipped into unconsciousness after that, his breathing shallow and labored. The end came quietly just before dawn, with Grace holding his hand and Zeke standing silent vigil nearby. "He's gone," Grace said softly, as Edward's final breath rattled out and his hand went slack in hers. Zeke moved to the bedside and gently closed Edward's eyes. "He was a good man." "Yes," Grace agreed, tears slipping down her cheeks, not for lost love, but for the waste of life, for the kindness shown to her by a stranger, and for the uncertainty that now stretched before her. He was. They buried Edward Harrington 2 days later in the small family plot on a hill overlooking the ranch. The service was attended by the ranch hands, neighboring ranchers, and townspeople from Lone Pine, more people than Grace had expected, a testament to the respect Edward had earned. As the mourners dispersed, heading back to the house where Mrs. Flores had prepared food, Zeke remained by the fresh grave with Grace. "He asked me to tell you to stay," Zeke said finally, breaking the silence between them. "But it's more complicated than that." Grace turned to face him. "What do you mean?" Zeke sighed, looking out over the ranch spread below them. "This place isn't just land and cattle. It's people who depend on it for their livelihoods. Edward built something special here, treated his hands fairly, stood up to the bigger outfits that tried to squeeze out smaller ranchers." He looked back at her. "That's what he wanted preserved, not just the broken spur, but what it stands for." "And he didn't think I could do that on my own," Grace surmised, a touch of bitterness in her voice. "He thought you'd need help, at least at first," Zeke corrected. "Ranching isn't like anything you knew in Boston. It's hard, dangerous work, and the business side can be just as cutthroat." Grace considered his words. "So what exactly did he ask of you, Mr. Armstrong, to stay on as foreman, to teach you the business, and to—" He hesitated, seeming uncomfortable. "To protect you if needed." "I see," Grace said slowly. "And if I choose to sell the ranch and return east?" Something tightened in Zeke's expression. "That would be your right as his widow, but I hope you'll at least take some time to consider what the broken spur means to everyone who works here before you decide." Grace looked at the grave, the fresh earth still bare in the late June sunlight. She'd been married to Edward Harrington for less than a week, had known him for barely longer, yet she'd inherited not just his property, but his legacy, a responsibility she hadn't fully understood when she'd agreed to his proposition. "I won't make any hasty decisions," she promised. "For now, I'd like to learn about the ranch. Will you show me? Teach me what I need to know?" Relief flickered across Zeke's face. "Of course, Mrs. Harrington. Grace," she corrected him. "If we're to work together, you should call me Grace." He nodded, the barest hint of a smile touching his lips. "Grace, then. And I'm Zeke to most everyone except the new hands." As they walked back toward the house, Grace felt the weight of her new position settling on her shoulders. She was now the owner of the Broken Spur Ranch, a widow at 23, and entirely dependent on the man beside her to navigate this unfamiliar world. "We'll start tomorrow," Zeke said as they neared the house. "I'll show you the operation, introduce you properly to the hands." "Thank you," Grace replied. Then impulsively she added, "Why did you agree? To Edward's request, I mean." Zeke was quiet for several steps before answering. "I owed him. He took a chance on me when I was just a wild kid with nothing but the clothes on my back. Gave me responsibility, taught me the business." He paused, his expression solemn. "And I believe in what he built here. I want to see it continue." Grace nodded, understanding. Loyalty and purpose, strong motivations indeed. As they rejoined the mourners at the house, she wondered if she could ever earn that same loyalty for herself, or find a purpose here that was truly her own. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Grace immersed herself in learning about the ranch. True to his word, Zeke proved an informative if sometimes taciturn guide, showing her every aspect of the operation from the cattle breeding program to the hay meadows, from the contracts with buyers to the account books. July brought scorching heat to the eastern Sierra, the days long and dusty as the ranch hands moved cattle to higher pastures and prepared for the late summer roundup. Grace insisted on accompanying Zeke whenever possible, trading her eastern dresses for practical divided riding skirts that scandalized Mrs. Flores, but earned grudging approval from the cowboys. "You're a quick study," Zeke remarked one evening as they sat on the porch after a long day, going over the books. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I've always been good with figures," Grace replied, studying the ledger before her. "My father was a bookkeeper. He taught me, it shows." Zeke leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs. "You've spotted 3 discrepancies I missed." Grace smiled, pleased by the compliment. Over the past weeks, Zeke had gradually relaxed his formal demeanor around her, though he maintained a careful distance that she understood was as much for propriety's sake as anything else. A young widow living alone with a ranch full of men was already the subject of town gossip, according to Mrs. Flores. "The cattle operation seems sound," Grace said, returning to the ledger. "But I'm concerned about how dependent we are on the Army contracts if they decide to source their beef elsewhere." "That's been on my mind too," Zeke admitted. "Edward was working on diversifying before he got sick. There's good money in horses if we can develop the right breeding stock." "Show me the figures tomorrow," Grace suggested. "I'd like to understand the investment required." Zeke nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "You're thinking like a rancher already." The comment warmed her more than it should have. Over these weeks, she'd come to respect Zeke's knowledge and dedication, to appreciate his quiet competence and unexpected moments of dry humor. But she'd also begun to notice other things: the way sunlight caught in his hair, the strength in his hands, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. Such thoughts were inappropriate for a new widow, she reminded herself sternly. Besides, Zeke had given no indication that he saw her as anything but his employer and Edward's legacy to be protected. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider, one of the hands returning from town with the mail. He handed a letter to Zeke, who recognized the handwriting and frowned. "It's from Thomas Harrington," he said, referring to Edward's nephew in San Francisco. "Addressed to you." Grace took the envelope with a sense of foreboding. She'd written to Thomas after Edward's death, as propriety demanded, but had received no reply until now. Opening the letter, she scanned its contents, her expression darkening. "He's coming to visit," she said flatly. "Next week, to discuss the future of the ranch, as he puts it." Zeke's jaw tightened. He wasted no time. "He expresses his condolences for my brief and unfortunate marriage and hopes I won't find it too difficult to relinquish the burden of such a large operation." Grace's voice was cool as she quoted from the letter. "He seems to assume I'll be eager to sell." "Are you?" Zeke asked. His tone carefully neutral. Grace folded the letter deliberately and met his gaze. "I haven't decided yet, but I don't appreciate being treated as if I have no say in the matter." A slight smile tugged at Zeke's lips. "Thomas Harrington is in for a surprise, then." "Indeed he is," Grace agreed, a spark of defiance kindling within her. "I may be new to ranching, but I'm not a pushover, nor am I incapable of learning." "I never thought you were," Zeke said quietly, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. Grace looked away first, suddenly conscious of the growing twilight and their solitude on the porch. "I should go in. There's still the correspondence to answer." Zeke nodded, rising to his feet. "I'll check on the night watch, then turn in. Morning comes early." As he descended the porch steps, Grace called after him, "Zeke, thank you for everything you're teaching me." He turned, his expression softened by the gathering darkness. "You're welcome, Grace." "Good night." Watching him walk toward the bunkhouse, Grace felt a complicated mix of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, but also something more troubling, a growing awareness of Zeke Armstrong as a man, not just as Edward's foreman or her teacher in ranch matters. Such feelings were entirely inappropriate, she reminded herself firmly. Not only was she still in mourning, but any hint of attachment between them would confirm the worst suspicions of the gossips in Lone Pine. For the sake of her reputation and the ranch's standing, she needed to keep her relationship with Zeke strictly professional. Yet as she went inside, Grace couldn't help wondering if the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her sometimes meant he was fighting a similar battle. Thomas Harrington arrived the following Thursday, driving a rented buggy from Lone Pine with the air of a man convinced of his own importance. He was a well-dressed man in his 40s, with Edward's height but none of his lean strength, his soft hands and portly figure testifying to a life of urban comfort. Grace received him in the parlor, dressed in her most formal black dress, with Zeke standing nearby in uncharacteristically clean attire, a silent but unmistakable message that they presented a united front. "My dear Mrs. Harrington," Thomas greeted her with exaggerated sympathy. "How brave you are, enduring such a difficult situation. My poor uncle's illness must have been most distressing for a young bride." "Your uncle faced his end with dignity and courage," Grace replied coolly. "I was honored to be with him in his final days." Thomas nodded solemnly, though his eyes were already scanning the room, assessing its contents. "And now you find yourself the mistress of this rustic establishment. It must be overwhelming for a city-bred lady such as yourself." "Actually, I'm adapting quite well," Grace countered. "The Broken Spur is a well-run operation with excellent staff." She nodded toward Zeke. "I believe you know Mr. Armstrong, your uncle's foreman." Thomas barely glanced at Zeke. "Ah, yes, Armstrong. Uncle Edward mentioned you in his letters." The dismissive tone made it clear he considered Zeke little more than a hired hand. Zeke simply nodded, his expression neutral but his posture tense. Grace could sense his dislike of Thomas, carefully controlled but palpable. "Mr. Armstrong has been invaluable in teaching me about the ranch," Grace continued pointedly. "I'm fortunate to have his expertise as I learn the business." Thomas raised his eyebrows. "My dear lady, surely you don't intend to run this place yourself?" "A cattle ranch is no environment for a gentlewoman. The isolation, the rough men, the physical demands, it's simply not suitable." Grace smiled thinly. "I find the environment quite invigorating, actually, and the men have been nothing but respectful." "Nevertheless," Thomas pressed, leaning forward eagerly, "you must see that selling is the sensible option. I've taken the liberty of contacting several potential buyers. The Sierra Land Company in particular is quite interested. They've offered a very generous sum." At the mention of Sierra Land, Zeke stiffened visibly. Grace, noting his reaction, said carefully, "I'm not considering selling at present, Mr. Harrington. Certainly not to Sierra Land." Thomas's affable mask slipped slightly. "That would be most unwise, Mrs. Harrington. Sierra Land controls much of the water access in this region. As a lone woman trying to run a ranch, you would find them difficult neighbors if you rebuff them." "Is that a threat?" Grace asked, her voice hardening. "Merely a statement of fact," Thomas replied smoothly. "Business in the West can be quite cutthroat. I worry for your safety, of course." Zeke stepped forward then, his patience apparently at an end. "Sierra Land has been trying to get the broken spur for years. Edward refused to sell because he knew they'd drive off the smaller ranchers and control the whole valley. That's why he made sure Grace inherited instead of you." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "Mind your place, cowboy. This is a family matter." "Zeke is right," Grace interjected. "Your uncle explained his concerns to me. He wanted the ranch preserved intact, not carved up by land speculators." "My uncle was a sentimental old fool who didn't understand progress," Thomas snapped, abandoning his veneer of sympathy. "This territory is changing. The days of the small ranch are numbered. Sierra Land is offering you a chance to walk away with a fortune before things get difficult." "I'll take my chances," Grace replied, rising from her seat to signal the conversation was over. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have ranch matters to attend to." Thomas stood as well, his expression darkening. "I'll be in town for a few more days. Think carefully about your situation, Mrs. Harrington. A young widow alone. Accidents happen on ranches all the time. It would be a shame if something befell you with no family to look after your interests." Zeke moved forward, positioning himself between Thomas and Grace. "I think you should leave now, Harrington." For a moment, tension crackled in the air as the two men faced each other. Then Thomas stepped back, forcing a laugh. "No need for dramatics, Armstrong. I'm merely concerned for my late uncle's wife." He turned to Grace, bowing slightly. "Consider my advice, Mrs. Harrington. I'll call again before I return to San Francisco." After Zeke had escorted Thomas out and watched him drive away, he returned to find Grace standing by the window, her expression troubled. "He's working with Sierra Land," Zeke said flatly. "Has to be. They've been trying to buy up all the ranches in this valley for the past 3 years." "What would they do if they succeeded?" Grace asked. "Squeeze out the small operators, control all the water rights, then sell to the railroad or Eastern investors at a huge profit." Zeke's disgust was evident. "Men like Edward built this country with their sweat and blood, only for vultures like Sierra Land to swoop in and take the rewards." Grace turned to face him. "Was that what Edward was protecting? The smaller ranchers?" Zeke nodded. "He stood up for them when Sierra Land started damming streams and claiming water rights. Made enemies, but he had the money and influence to fight back. The smaller places don't. And now that responsibility falls to me." Grace said softly, understanding another piece of her inheritance. If you choose to accept it, Zeke replied. No one would blame you for selling and going back east, especially after Thomas's threats. Is that what you think I should do? She challenged, searching his face. Zeke was silent for a long moment. What I think doesn't matter. It's your decision. It matters to me, Grace insisted. You knew Edward better than anyone. What would he want me to do? He'd want you to be safe, Zeke said finally. But he'd also hope you'd carry on what he started. He hesitated, then added more quietly, for what it's worth, I think you could do it. You're stronger than Thomas realizes. Smarter too. The unexpected vote of confidence warmed her. Then I'll stay and fight, she decided. But I'll need your help, Zeke, not just with running the ranch, but with understanding these battles Edward was fighting. You have it, he promised, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. Whatever comes. That night, after Zeke had gone to his quarters in the foreman's cabin, Grace sat at Edward's desk, reviewing documents she'd found in his private correspondence letters about water rights, testimonials from smaller ranchers about Sierra Land's tactics, and draft legislation Edward had been supporting in the territorial legislature. The scope of what she'd inherited went far beyond cattle and land, she realized. Edward Harrington had positioned himself as a defender of the independent rancher against corporate interests. In marrying her and making her his heir, he hadn't just been seeking care in his final days, he'd been choosing a successor he hoped would continue his fight. Could she be that person? A Boston bookkeeper's daughter, transplanted to the wild terrain of the eastern Sierra. The challenge seemed overwhelming, yet also strangely exhilarating. As she finally retired to bed, Grace made a decision. She would not be intimidated by Thomas Harrington or Sierra Land. She would learn everything she needed to know about ranching, water rights, and territorial politics. And with Zeke Armstrong at her side, she would preserve what Edward had built not just for herself, but for all those who depended on the broken spur. The next morning, she rose at dawn and dressed in her riding clothes, determined to begin this new chapter properly. When she descended to the kitchen, she found Zeke already there, drinking coffee with Mrs. Flores. I want to ride the northern boundary today, she announced without preamble. Thomas mentioned Sierra Land is putting in a new dam. I want to see it for myself. Zeke looked up, surprise giving way to approval. It's rough country up there, at least a 4-hour ride each way. Then we should get started, Grace replied, accepting the coffee Mrs. Flores offered. I need to understand exactly what we're facing. By mid-morning, they were deep in the foothills, following a stream that marked the northern boundary of broken spur land. The July sun beat down fiercely, but the higher elevation brought welcome breezes as they rode side by side through pine forests and open meadows. Grace had improved markedly as a rider over the past weeks, and she handled her mount with growing confidence as they navigated the uneven terrain. Zeke watched her with quiet appreciation, noting how she'd adapted to this new life with a determination that impressed him more each day. There, he said finally, pointing ahead to where the stream narrowed between rocky banks. That's where our property ends. Sierra Land owns everything on the other side. They dismounted to rest the horses, and Grace walked to the edge of the stream, observing how it flowed down toward the valley where the broken spur's main pastures lay. If they dam this higher up, she said thoughtfully, they could cut off our water supply. Exactly, Zeke confirmed, coming to stand beside her. Edward fought them in court last year when they tried, won on the basis of prior water rights, but with him gone. They think I'll be an easier target, Grace finished. She looked up at him, her expression resolute. They're mistaken. Something in her determination stirred Zeke deeply. This woman who had arrived as a contract bride just weeks ago now stood ready to defend her new home with a fierceness that matched any he'd seen in the toughest cowboys. "We should keep going," he suggested. "See exactly what they're building." They rode another hour upstream, crossing onto Sierra land property. Eventually, they came upon the construction site, a substantial dam being built across the stream, with a dozen men working under the supervision of a tall figure Grace recognized with a jolt of surprise. "That's Thomas," she whispered to Zeke as they observed from a stand of trees. "Why would he be out here?" Zeke's expression darkened. "Confirming his investment, I'd guess. I told you he was in with Sierra land." As they watched, Thomas conferred with another man in a suit, examining plans spread on a makeshift table. Their discussion seemed animated, with Thomas gesturing toward the valley below. "We've seen enough," Zeke said finally. "We should go before they spot us." They had just turned their horses when a shout went up from the construction site. Looking back, Grace saw Thomas pointing in their direction, his face contorted with anger even at a distance. "Ride," Zeke commanded, urging his horse into a gallop with Grace close behind. They thundered down the trail, the sounds of pursuit fading as they crossed back onto broken spur land. Only when they reached a meadow, several miles from the boundary, did they slow to a trot, the horses blowing hard from the exertion. "They won't follow us onto our property," Zeke said, though he kept glancing back. "Not in daylight, at least." "What did we just see, Zeke?" Grace asked, still trying to process Thomas's presence at the dam, confirmation of what we suspected. "Thomas is working with Sierra land, probably has been for years." Zeke's expression was grim. "That dam will divert most of our water by late summer if it's completed. Can we fight it legally, as Edward did? Maybe. But the territorial judge who ruled in Edward's favor last time has been replaced. The new one is said to favor development interests." Zeke shook his head. "We need to think of other approaches." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. The situation was more serious than Grace had realized. Without reliable water, the Broken Spurs cattle operation would be crippled. "The neighboring ranchers," she said suddenly. "The ones Edward was protecting. Would they stand with us against Sierra land?" Zeke considered this. "Some would. They have as much to lose as we do." "Then let's call a meeting," Grace decided. "Invite them to the Broken Spur. If we present a united front, perhaps we can find a solution together." Zeke studied her, a new respect in his eyes. That's exactly what Edward would have done. The compliment pleased her more than it should have. "I'm beginning to understand why this place meant so much to him. It's not just land and cattle, it's a way of life." "Yes," Zeke agreed quietly, "it is." As they continued toward home, Grace was acutely aware of Zeke riding beside her, his presence a source of both strength and increasingly confusing emotions. In the weeks since Edward's death, her reliance on him had deepened into something more: respect, certainly, but also a growing affection she tried to deny. He was unfailingly respectful, never crossing the boundaries of propriety, yet she sometimes caught him watching her with an expression that suggested he might be fighting similar feelings. But even if he were, what could come of it? She was still in mourning, still learning to be a rancher, still establishing her place in this community. And there was the matter of Thomas Harrington and Sierra land to deal with, a threat that now seemed more immediate and dangerous than she had imagined. As they rode back toward the ranch house, the shadow of the unfinished dam hung over them, a reminder of the battle to come. The meeting of neighboring ranchers took place 3 days later in the Broken Spurs main barn, cleared and arranged with benches for the occasion. A dozen men attended, representing the smaller operations scattered throughout the valley, weathered, practical men who viewed Grace with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Zeke had explained that most had respected Edward but might doubt a woman's ability to take his place in their fight against Sierra Land. Grace knew she would have to prove herself, and quickly. "Thank you all for coming," she began, standing before them with Zeke at her side. "I know some of you may wonder why a woman from Boston is asking for your time and attention." "We're wondering, all right," confirmed one grizzled rancher named Peterson. "No offense, Mrs. Harrington, but this valley needs a strong hand now that Edward's gone." "I may not have a man's strength, Mr. Peterson," Grace replied evenly, "but I have something perhaps more valuable, a fresh perspective and a commitment to what my husband built here." She proceeded to outline what she and Zeke had observed at the dam site, including Thomas's involvement. As she spoke, the men's expressions shifted from skepticism to concern. "If that dam is completed," said Miller, whose small ranch lay east of the broken spur, "half of us will be dried out by August." "Exactly," Grace agreed, "which is why we need to work together. Sierra Land is counting on picking us off individually." "What do you propose?" asked Thornton, an older rancher with a reputation for caution. Grace glanced at Zeke, who nodded encouragingly. "First, we pool our legal resources to challenge the dam. Second, we prepare alternative water sources, deeper wells, cisterns, whatever we can manage. And third," she paused, knowing her next suggestion was bold, "we form a ranchers' association with a binding agreement not to sell to Sierra Land under any circumstances." A murmur ran through the gathering. What she proposed would require trust and cooperation among men who traditionally prized independence. "It won't be easy," Zeke added, stepping forward. "Sierra Land plays rough. They've hired gunmen before to intimidate holdouts." "All the more reason to stand together," Grace insisted. "My husband believed this valley's strength was in its independent ranchers. He refused to be bullied by corporate interests, and I intend to do the same." Peterson studied her thoughtfully. "Edward said something similar last spring. Called it the Ranchers' Compact. Never got around to formalizing it before he took sick." "Then let's honor his memory by doing it now," Grace suggested. The discussion continued for hours, moving from initial skepticism to serious planning. By evening, a tentative agreement had been reached. They would form the Eastern Sierra Ranchers Association, with each member pledging not to sell without the other's approval. They would also share costs for legal challenges to the dam and coordinate on alternative water strategies. As the ranchers departed, several nodded respectfully to Grace, their initial doubts at least partially allayed. Peterson, the most skeptical at the start, paused before leaving. "Edward chose better than he knew," he told her gruffly. "You've got grit, Mrs. Harrington." When the last visitor had gone, Grace sank onto a bench, suddenly exhausted. The day had been a success, but she knew it was only the beginning of a difficult fight. Zeke sat beside her, his shoulder almost but not quite touching hers. "You did well," he said simply. "They respect you now." "I hope it's enough," she replied, conscious of his nearness. "Sierra Land won't give up easily." "No," he agreed. "And now that Thomas knows we've seen him at the dam, he may make his move sooner rather than later." Grace nodded, a chill running through her despite the summer evening's warmth. "We should be prepared for trouble. I've already spoken to the hands. Double watches at night, no one rides alone." Zeke hesitated, then added, "And I think you should keep a revolver close at hand. I could teach you to shoot if you don't know how." The suggestion startled her, though she knew it shouldn't have. This was the reality of her new life, not just account books and cattle prices, but the possibility of genuine danger. "My father taught me the basics," she said, "though it's been years since I practiced." "Tomorrow, then," Zeke said, rising and offering her his hand. "We'll see how much you remember." Grace allowed him to help her up, the brief contact of his calloused palm against hers sending an unexpected warmth through her arm. "Thank you, Zeke, for everything today." He held her gaze for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. "You're finding your place here," he said finally. "Edward would be proud." The words touched her deeply. "I hope so." As they walked back to the house in the gathering twilight, side by side but not touching, Grace was aware of a shifting in their relationship, subtle but significant. Today, she had taken a step toward truly becoming the mistress of the broken spur, not just in name but in function. And in doing so, she sensed that Zeke was beginning to see her differently, not as Edward's widow to be protected, but as a partner in the struggles to come. The thought both exhilarated and frightened her. Their circumstances made any deeper connection between them complicated at best, impossible at worst. Yet she couldn't deny the growing pull she felt toward him, or the way his rare smiles made her heart beat faster. Such feelings would have to wait, she told herself firmly. The fight for the broken spur's survival had to come first. But as they reached the house and Zeke bid her good night, his eyes lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary, Grace wondered if he too was fighting a battle on two fronts, one for the ranch, and one within his own heart. The following weeks brought an escalation in tensions across the valley. Word came that Sierra Land had accelerated work on the dam, bringing in additional men to complete it before any legal challenges could be mounted. Meanwhile, the newly formed Ranchers Association filed protests with the territorial authorities, only to face delays and bureaucratic obstacles that Zeke suspected were engineered by Sierra Land's influence. August arrived with scorching heat and the first signs of water shortage. The stream flowing through the broken spur's northern pastures had diminished to a trickle, forcing Grace and Zeke to move cattle to southern grazing lands earlier than planned. Through it all, Grace continued her education in ranch management, spending long days in the saddle alongside Zeke and the other hands, learning every aspect of the operation. Her city pallor had given way to a sun-bronzed complexion, her hands toughened by work, her confidence growing with each passing day. The shooting lessons Zeke had suggested became a regular part of their routine. Each evening, they would ride to a secluded spot behind the barn where he had set up targets, and Grace would practice with both rifle and revolver until her aim was sure and her reactions quick. "You're a natural," Zeke commented one evening as she hit 5 bottles in succession with the Winchester. "Better than most of the hands." Grace lowered the rifle, pleased by the compliment. "I hope I never have to use these skills for anything but targets." "So do I," Zeke agreed, his expression somber. "But it's better to be prepared." They had just finished their practice and were walking back toward the barn when the sound of approaching riders made them both tense. Zeke moved slightly in front of Grace, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip, but relaxed when he recognized 2 of their own ranch hands returning early from town. "Mr. Armstrong," called the lead rider, reining in hard. "Trouble in Lone Pine." "Thomas Harrington's there with Sierra Land men, talking about coming out here tomorrow." "What kind of trouble?" Zeke asked sharply. "They're saying Mrs. Harrington has no legal right to the ranch," the cowboy reported, claiming the marriage wasn't proper and the will won't stand up in court. Grace felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "That's absurd. We were legally married with witnesses and a minister." "Doesn't matter if it's true," Zeke said grimly. "Just matters if they can convince a judge to question it long enough to tie us up in court." "There's more," the second hand added. "They've got some fancy lawyer from San Francisco with them, talking about an injunction against the Ranchers Association, calling it a conspiracy against legitimate business." Zeke muttered something under his breath that Grace pretended not to hear. "How many men with them?" "At least a dozen," came the reply. "Not just office types either, some hard cases mixed in." Grace and Zeke exchanged a look of understanding. Sierra Land was making its move, using legal maneuvers as a cover for what might become a more direct approach. "Get back to the house," Zeke told her. "I'll gather the men and make preparations." "I'm not hiding in the house while you face this," Grace objected. "This is my ranch, too." A flash of something pride, perhaps, or deeper feeling crossed Zeke's face. "I know it is. But we need to be smart about this. Thomas is looking for any excuse to discredit you. A confrontation plays into his hands." Reluctantly, Grace acknowledged the wisdom of his argument. "What's your plan?" "We'll bring the closest cattle in tonight, double the guards, and send word to the association members. If Sierra Land is coming in force, we want witnesses and plenty of them." The night passed tensely, with every hand on the broken spur armed and watchful. Grace, despite Zeke's objections, insisted on making rounds with Mrs. Flores, bringing coffee and food to the men standing guard. It was a small thing, but it cemented their loyalty in a way that orders alone could not. Near dawn, Peterson and 3 other ranchers from the association arrived with a half-dozen of their own hands, having ridden through the night after receiving the warning. More would come with daylight, they assured Grace. "Sierra Land won't find us easy pickings," Peterson declared, accepting coffee in the ranch house kitchen. "Not with the association standing together." By mid-morning, the Broken Spurs yard resembled an armed camp, with nearly 30 men gathered in defense of the ranch. Grace, dressed in her most formal attire, a black riding skirt and crisp white blouse, stood on the porch with Zeke and the other ranchers, watching the road from town. They came at noon, a procession of riders and wagons raising dust on the long approach to the ranch. At their head rode Thomas Harrington, alongside a thin man in an expensive suit whom Grace guessed was the San Francisco lawyer. Behind them came at least 20 men, some in business attire, others clearly gunmen from their hard faces and the way they carried themselves. "Quite a reception committee," Thomas called as they halted in the yard. "One might almost think you were expecting trouble, dear niece." "I'm not your niece, Mr. Harrington," Grace replied coolly. "And yes, we were expecting trouble. Word travels fast in this valley." The lawyer stepped forward, a document case in his hand. "Mrs. Harrington, I am James Wilson, representing Sierra Land Company and Mr. Thomas Harrington. We have legal papers to serve regarding the disposition of this property." "Any papers you have can be given to our lawyer in town," Zeke interrupted. "This looks more like intimidation than legal business." Wilson's thin lips curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "On the contrary, we're simply here to inform Mrs. Harrington of certain legal realities and to offer a solution that benefits all parties." "I'm listening," Grace said, though she had no intention of accepting whatever they proposed. Thomas stepped forward. "The fact is, my dear, that your marriage to my uncle was contracted under false pretenses. He was not of sound mind in his final weeks, as his doctor will attest. Therefore, the will leaving you this property is invalid." "That's a lie," Zeke said flatly. "Edward knew exactly what he was doing." "The opinion of a hired hand hardly matters in court," Wilson replied dismissively. "What does matter is that we have affidavits from reputable witnesses questioning both the marriage and the will." "Witnesses you paid, no doubt," Peterson interjected, moving to stand beside Grace. Thomas ignored him, focusing on Grace. "Rather than subjecting you to lengthy and embarrassing legal proceedings, we're prepared to offer you a generous settlement. $20,000, far more than a woman of your background could expect to see in a lifetime, in exchange for clear title to the Broken Spur." The sum was indeed substantial, enough to set her up comfortably anywhere she chose to go. For a fleeting moment, Grace considered what it would mean to leave this place, to escape the constant struggle and return to a more familiar life. Then she looked at the men around her. Zeke, whose quiet strength had been her anchor these past months. Peterson and the other ranchers who had accepted her as one of their own. The broken spur hands who watched her now, waiting to see if she would stand firm or abandon them to Sierra Land's mercies. "The broken spur is not for sale," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard. "Not to you, not to Sierra Land, not to anyone. This ranch was legally entrusted to me by my husband, and I intend to honor his wishes by keeping it intact." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "Don't be a fool, woman. You can't possibly run this place on your own, and once your water is gone—" "She's not on her own," Zeke cut in, moving closer to Grace. "And as for water, the Eastern Sierra Ranchers Association has already filed injunctions against your illegal dam." Wilson stepped forward, his demeanor now openly threatening. "The association itself is illegal, a conspiracy to prevent legitimate business development. We have orders from Judge Keene to that effect." He pulled a document from his case. "This authorizes us to disperse any such gathering and to take possession of disputed properties pending legal resolution." "Judge Keene has no jurisdiction here," Peterson objected. "This is county land, not territorial." "A technicality that will be resolved," Wilson replied smoothly. "In the meantime, we suggest you all depart peacefully. Sierra Land is prepared to be generous to those who cooperate." The tension in the yard was palpable, hands hovering near weapons, both sides measuring the other. Grace knew they were at a dangerous crossroads. Violence now would only serve Sierra Land's purposes, giving them an excuse to call in territorial authorities. "There will be no cooperation with theft, legal or otherwise," she declared, stepping forward. "The broken spur remains under my ownership, and these men are here as my invited guests. Any attempt to seize this property will be resisted with all necessary force." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the sound of more approaching riders drew everyone's attention. Coming down the road was another group, led by the silver-haired figure of Judge Monroe from the county seat, accompanied by the county sheriff and several deputies. Relief washed through Grace. Zeke had sent a rider to the county authorities the previous night, knowing that jurisdiction would be crucial in this confrontation. "What's going on here?" the sheriff called as they rode into the yard. "Looks like an army gathering." Wilson quickly tried to present his documents, but Judge Monroe waved them away. "I know all about Keene's so-called orders, Wilson. They have no standing here, and he knows it. This is pure overreach. We have legitimate claims against Mrs. Harrington's inheritance," Thomas protested. "The marriage was performed according to law with my own nephew as witness," the judge interrupted. "I've reviewed the documentation myself. Unless you have actual evidence of fraud, not just bought affidavits, your claims won't stand in my court." The arrival of county authorities had shifted the balance decisively. Several of Sierra Land's hired guns were already drifting back toward their horses, unwilling to challenge official law enforcement. "This isn't over," Thomas said, his voice tight with suppressed rage as he glared at Grace. "Sierra Land doesn't give up what it wants." "Neither do I," Grace replied steadily. "Neither do any of us." She gestured to the ranchers and hands surrounding her. "This valley isn't for sale." With the sheriff watching closely, Thomas and his entourage had little choice but to withdraw. As they rode away, Judge Monroe approached Grace and Zeke. "You've made powerful enemies," he observed. "Sierra Land has connections all the way to Washington." "We know," Grace acknowledged, "but we also have right on our side and the determination to fight for it." The judge smiled slightly. "Edward chose well when he married you, Mrs. Harrington. He'd be proud to see you carrying on his work." "She's not alone in that," Zeke added, his shoulder nearly touching Grace's as they stood side by side. Monroe looked between them, something knowing in his aged eyes. "No, I can see that she's not." To Grace, he added more quietly, "When you're ready, young woman, come see me in town. There are legal steps we can take to strengthen your position and the associations against future challenges." After the judge and sheriff departed, the tension gradually dissipated from the ranch. The visiting ranchers remained for a celebratory meal prepared by Mrs. Flores, the conversation flowing more easily now that the immediate threat had been repelled. It was late evening by the time the last guests departed, leaving Grace and Zeke alone on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear summer sky. "We won a battle today," Zeke said after a comfortable silence. "But the war isn't over." "I know," Grace replied. "Thomas and Sierra Land will try again, perhaps more subtly next time." Zeke nodded, his profile strong in the moonlight. "But we're stronger too. The association is real now, tested, and you've proven yourself to everyone who matters." Grace turned to study him, this man who had been her guide and support through the most challenging months of her life. "Including you." His eyes met hers, something unguarded in them for the first time. "You never needed to prove yourself to me, Grace. I've believed in you since the day you faced down Edward's illness without flinching." The admission stirred something deep within her. "Zeke." He shook his head slightly. "You don't need to say anything. I know it's too soon, with Edward gone only a few months." "I know there are proprieties to consider." "Proprieties," Grace echoed, a touch of irony in her voice. "I've married a dying man I barely knew, inherited a cattle ranch, and faced down corporate gunmen. I think we're well past conventional proprieties." A smile touched Zeke's lips. "Maybe so. But I still respect you too much to rush what's growing between us." The acknowledgement that he felt it too, this connection that had been strengthening with each passing day, sent a flutter of warmth through Grace's chest. "What if I don't want to wait?" she asked softly. "Life out here is uncertain. Today proved that." Zeke turned to face her fully, moonlight silvering his features. "Grace, when Edward asked me to look after you, to tell you to stay, I agreed because I owed him everything. But these past months, watching you fight for this land, seeing your strength and determination, my reasons have changed." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. "If you stay now, I want it to be for your own reasons. Because you love the Broken Spur, because you believe in what we're building here with the association." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "And maybe someday, because of what's between us." Grace reached out, her fingers just brushing his hand. "I do love this place," she admitted. "More than I ever thought possible. It's become my home." "And the rest?" Zeke asked, his fingers closing gently around hers. Instead of answering with words, Grace closed the distance between them, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepening as Zeke's arms came around her, drawing her closer. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Grace saw in his eyes the same mixture of surprise and rightness that she felt. "I think that answers the question," she said with a small smile. Zeke touched her cheek gently. "It's a start," he agreed. "But we have time now. Time to be sure, time to do this properly." Grace nodded, understanding his caution even as part of her wanted to rush headlong into this new feeling. They had faced one challenge together and prevailed, but others would come. The foundation they built now for the ranch, for the association, for themselves needed to be solid enough to withstand whatever Sierra Land and the changing West might throw at them. "Time," she agreed, "but not too much. I've learned that life is too uncertain for unnecessary waiting." Zeke smiled, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his face and made Grace's heart skip. "Agreed. No unnecessary waiting." As they stood together in the moonlight, the Broken Spur spreading around them like a kingdom they would defend together, Grace thought of the strange path that had led her here, from desperate contract, bride to ranch owner, from stranger to leader, from loneliness to this moment of connection with a man whose strength matched her own. Edward had given her more than property in his final act. He had given her purpose, community, and the chance to find a love far deeper than their brief arranged marriage could have provided. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with Zeke beside her, both of them committed to preserving what Edward Harrington had built and creating something new that was uniquely their own. The following months brought both challenges and victories for the Broken Spur and the Eastern Sierra Ranchers Association. The legal battle over water rights continued through the fall, with Judge Monroe ruling in favor of the association's right to equitable access to the streams. Sierra Land was ordered to modify their dam to allow sufficient flow to downstream ranches, a significant victory, though one they complied with grudgingly and incompletely. Thomas Harrington returned to San Francisco after his failed attempt to seize the ranch, but Grace knew he hadn't given up. Reports from business contacts in the city indicated he was seeking new investors for another attempt to consolidate control of the valley, perhaps in the spring. Meanwhile, life on the Broken Spur settled into a rhythm that Grace came to cherish. The fall cattle drive to market was successful, bringing in enough profit to invest in improvements to the ranch's water storage capacity and to purchase breeding stock for the horse program Zeke had suggested. Through it all, her relationship with Zeke deepened gradually, growing from mutual respect to genuine partnership to a love that became the foundation of everything else. They were careful to maintain propriety in public. Grace was still technically in mourning for Edward. After all, but the ranch hands and neighboring ranchers weren't blind. The way they looked at each other told its own story. As winter approached, bringing the first snows to the Sierra Nevada and a quieter season to the ranch, Grace and Zeke found more time for private conversations, riding together in the crisp December air or talking late into the evening by the fireplace after the day's work was done. One such evening, with Christmas just a week away, they sat side by side in the parlor, discussing plans for spring breeding and the latest letter from the association's lawyer regarding water rights legislation. "If the Territorial Assembly passes this bill," Grace said, studying the documents, "it would protect all the smaller ranchers from the kind of water monopoly Sierra Land was attempting." "It's a good start," Zeke agreed, "though enforcement will still be an issue in remote areas." Grace set the papers aside, turning to face him more directly. "Do you ever regret it, staying here fighting these battles? You could have moved on after Edward died, found a foreman position without all this complication." Zeke's expression softened as he looked at her. "Not for a single moment. Everything that matters to me is right here." The simple declaration warmed her more than the crackling fire. Over the months, Zeke had become more open with his feelings, though he remained a man of actions more than words. "I've been thinking," Grace said after a moment, "about the future. About us." Zeke took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "What about us?" "My official mourning period ends next month," she said. "And while I respected Edward and am grateful for what he gave me, ours wasn't a love match. We both know that." "We do," Zeke agreed, watching her face carefully. "I don't want to wait any more," Grace continued, her voice gaining confidence. "Life out here has taught me to value what's real and not to waste time on empty conventions. What we have is real, Zeke, more real than anything I've known." A smile slowly spread across his face. "Are you proposing to me, Grace Harrington?" "Perhaps I am," she replied, returning his smile. "Would that be so terrible? A woman asking a man?" Zeke laughed, the sound rich and warm in the quiet room. "Not terrible at all. Just unexpected, like so many things about you." His expression grew more serious as he took both her hands in his. "But I can't let you do it." For a moment, doubt flickered through Grace, until Zeke slid from the sofa to one knee before her. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment," he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small ring, a simple band with a modest diamond that caught the firelight. "It was my mother's. I've had it sent from my sister in Texas." Grace's breath caught as he held it out to her. "Grace Campbell Harrington," Zeke said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because Edward asked me to look after you, not because the ranch needs us both, but because I love you more than I ever thought possible and can't imagine my life without you in it." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Zeke Armstrong, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to sit beside her again, drawing her into his arms for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Grace rested her forehead against his. "When?" she asked simply. "Spring," Zeke suggested. "After the thaw, when the wildflowers come back to the meadows, we could marry there on the ranch with our friends around us." The image was perfect, a celebration of new beginnings in the place that had become home to them both. "Spring," she agreed. "Though it seems a long time to wait." Zeke's eyes darkened slightly. "It does," he admitted, "but worth it to do things right." They were still discussing wedding plans when a commotion outside drew their attention. Zeke moved quickly to the window, then turned back to Grace with a frown. "Riders coming in fast, too many for this time of night." They hurried to the porch where they could see half a dozen men on horseback approaching the ranch house at a gallop. As they drew closer, Grace recognized Peterson leading the group. "Grace, Zeke," he called as they reined in. "We've got trouble. Sierra Land men burned out the Miller place tonight." "What?" Grace gasped. "Is everyone all right? Family got out safely, but they've lost everything: house, barn, winter stores." Peterson's face was grim in the lantern light. "It's no accident. Miller turned down their offer to buy him out yesterday." Zeke's expression hardened. "Where are the Millers now?" "Thornton took them in, but they're not safe there. Sierra Land made it clear they're just getting started." Grace and Zeke exchanged a look of understanding. The conflict they had hoped was subsiding had just escalated dangerously. "Bring them here," Grace decided immediately. "The Broken Spur has room and we're better defended than most." Peterson nodded. "That's what we hoped you'd say. There's more, though. Word in town is that Sierra Land's brought in professional gunmen from Nevada, not just to intimidate, but to eliminate obstacles." The implications were clear. The association's stand against Sierra Land had moved beyond legal battles to open violence. "We need to gather the association," Zeke said. "All the ranchers here at the Broken Spur. We're stronger together, and this place is the most defensible in the valley." "Already sent riders to spread the word," Peterson confirmed, "but some of the outlying ranches might not get warning in time." Grace felt the weight of leadership settle on her shoulders, not just for the Broken Spur now, but for all the independent ranchers who had trusted in the association she had helped create. "We'll send our own men to bring in anyone who might be at risk," she decided. "And we'll need to prepare for a siege: food, water, ammunition." Zeke nodded his approval. "I'll organize the hands into patrols. No one goes out alone." As they moved into action, Grace was conscious of how naturally they worked together, her strategic thinking complementing Zeke's practical experience. The engagement ring was a new weight on her finger, but their partnership had been forged through months of shared purpose. The next few days transformed the Broken Spur into something resembling a fortress. Families from 6 smaller ranches sought refuge there, bringing what livestock and possessions they could transport. The main house, bunkhouses, and barns became temporary homes for nearly 40 people, including women and children. Grace worked tirelessly to organize accommodations, food supplies, and care for the displaced families, while Zeke coordinated defenses with the other ranchers. Sentries were posted around the clock, and no one ventured beyond the ranch's immediate boundaries without armed escort. News from town was troubling. Sierra Land men had taken over the saloon and were making threats against association members, while the county sheriff seemed reluctant to intervene, possibly intimidated or bribed. "They're trying to break us," Grace observed to Zeke as they reviewed reports on the evening of the third day. "Isolate us from town, cut off supplies, make the cost of resistance too high." "It's working on some," Zeke admitted. "Johnson's talking about selling out if Sierra Land will guarantee safe passage to Oregon for his family." "We can't blame him," Grace said. "Not everyone can fight indefinitely." Zeke's hand covered hers where it rested on the desk. "What about you? This isn't what you signed up for when you came west." Grace turned her hand to clasp his firmly. "It's exactly what I signed up for. Edward knew what he was doing when he chose me as his successor." "I may not have understood it then, but I do now." Pride and love mingled in Zeke's expression. "We'll get through this," he promised. "Together." The stalemate continued for another week, with sporadic incidents of intimidation against outlying properties but no direct assault on the broken spur. Grace and the other ranchers used the time to strengthen their legal position, sending affidavits and evidence of Sierra Land's tactics to both the county court and territorial authorities. Then came unexpected news from San Francisco, delivered by a lawyer friend of Judge Monroe's who had made the dangerous journey to the ranch. "Thomas Harrington has overplayed his hand," the lawyer informed them, addressing the assembled ranchers in the main house. "His Sierra Land partners are involved in a financial scandal in San Francisco. Several investors have pulled out, and there are rumors of an investigation by federal authorities." "What does that mean for us?" Peterson asked. "It means they are vulnerable," the lawyer explained. "Their California operations are dangerously short on capital. If you can hold out a few more weeks, they might be forced to withdraw from this territory entirely." The news brought cautious optimism to the beleaguered ranchers, but Grace and Zeke remained wary. "A cornered animal is most dangerous," Zeke observed that night as they walked along the porch, checking on sentries. "If Sierra Land is desperate, they might try something reckless." His prediction proved accurate sooner than either expected. Shortly after midnight, a sentry's warning shot split the darkness, followed by shouts of alarm. Zeke and Grace rushed to the north side of the ranch compound, where they found the guards pointing toward several dark figures retreating toward the tree line. "Fire starters," one of the hands reported grimly. "Caught them trying to set the north barn ablaze. Would have taken the whole place with this wind." "How many?" Zeke demanded. "5 or 6 that we saw. Might be more out there." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December night. "They're getting desperate," she said quietly to Zeke. "Direct assault will come next," he nodded, his expression grave. "We need to evacuate the women and children at first light. The pass to the county seat is still open, despite the snow. They'll be safer there under Judge Monroe's protection." Though it pained her to separate families, Grace knew he was right. By dawn, preparations were underway, with the strongest wagon reinforced and provisioned for the journey. "You should go with them," Zeke told Grace as the women and children prepared to depart. "Your Sierra Land's primary target," Grace shook her head firmly. "My place is here. The men are fighting for my ranch as much as their own. I won't abandon them." Though she could see he wanted to argue, Zeke respected her decision. They stood together as the wagon departed, a heavily armed escort of 4 riders surrounding it. "God keep them safe," Grace murmured as the wagon disappeared around a bend in the road. "Amen," Zeke replied, his hand finding hers briefly. They had just turned back toward the house when a rider appeared on the road from town, pushing his horse at a dangerous pace. As he drew closer, they recognized him as the young deputy from the county sheriff's office who had been sympathetic to their cause. Mrs. Harrington. He called, reining in hard. Mr. Armstrong. Sierra Land's men are coming. At least 20 armed riders left town an hour ago, heading this way. Zeke sprang into action immediately, calling orders to the ranchers and hands. Defensive positions. Everyone armed and ready. Grace hurried to the house to secure the rifles and ammunition they had stockpiled, her heart pounding but her hands steady. This was the moment they had prepared for, the direct confrontation that had been building since Edward's death. When she returned to the yard, Zeke was organizing men into defensive positions around the ranch buildings. Seeing her approach with a rifle in hand, he paused briefly. "Grace," he said, his voice low and intense. "If this goes badly, it won't," she interrupted, meeting his gaze steadily. "If it does," he insisted, "promise me you'll get out. The back trail to the high meadows is still passable. Peterson knows it." Before she could argue, the lookout called a warning. Riders approaching from the east. There was no more time for private words. Grace took up position on the porch with several of the older ranchers, while Zeke coordinated the younger men at the perimeter. The Sierra Land force came into view slowly, deliberately, a show of strength rather than a surprise attack. At their head rode a tall man in a black coat whom Grace didn't recognize, flanked by two obvious gunfighters. Thomas Harrington was noticeably absent. "That's Clay Barton," Peterson murmured from beside her. "Sierra Land's enforcer from Nevada, mean as a wounded rattler and twice as dangerous." The riders halted just beyond rifle range. Barton raised his hand in a deceptively casual greeting. "Mrs. Harrington," he called, "we're here on legitimate business for Sierra Land Company. No need for all these guns if you're reasonable folks." "State your business, then," Grace called back, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Simple enough. Sierra Land now holds the notes on 5 of the ranches whose owners are sheltering here. We've come to take possession of our property and to offer you one final opportunity to sell the Broken Spur before foreclosure proceedings begin." A murmur of confusion and alarm spread among the ranchers. Grace glanced at Peterson, whose face had paled. "It might be true," he admitted quietly. Johnson and Miller both had bank loans in Lone Pine. If Sierra Land bought the bank. Grace's mind raced. This was a new tactic, one they hadn't anticipated, using financial means rather than force to break up the association. Zeke appeared at her side, having moved quietly from his position. "It's a bluff," he said in a low voice. "They don't have the capital for those purchases, not with their troubles in San Francisco." Grace nodded slightly, then raised her voice again. "Mr. Barton, we'll need to see proper documentation of these alleged purchases. Until then, these ranchers remain lawful owners of their property and my guests on the Broken Spur." Barton's face hardened. "Documentation is in town with our lawyer, but my patience isn't. You have 1 hour to clear out those who don't belong here, or we'll consider this an illegal occupation and respond accordingly." "And if we refuse?" Grace challenged. The threat in Barton's smile was unmistakable. "Then things get messy, Mrs. Harrington. Sierra Land isn't particular about how we acquire property, just that we get what we want in the end." With that, he wheeled his horse around and led his men back down the road a short distance, clearly intending to wait out the hour. The ranchers gathered quickly in the house to discuss their options. Opinions were divided, some believing they should hold their ground, others fearing for their families if violence erupted. "If they really have bought our loans," Miller said dejectedly, "fighting will just get people killed for nothing. We've already lost the ranches." "We don't know that for certain," Grace countered. "This could be a bluff to divide us." "And if it's not?" Johnson asked. My wife and children are on that wagon to the county seat. I need to be alive to take care of them, even if it means starting over elsewhere." The debate continued, growing more heated until Zeke's voice cut through the arguments. "Listen," he said sharply. "Something's happening outside." They rushed to the windows to see a new group of riders approaching from the west, a dozen men led by a familiar figure in a sheriff's uniform. "It's Sheriff Taylor," Peterson exclaimed, "and Judge Monroe with him." Relief swept through Grace as she hurried outside with the others. The sheriff's party rode directly past the Sierra Land men, who watched with obvious displeasure as the newcomers entered the Broken Spur yard. "Mrs. Harrington," the sheriff greeted her, touching his hat. "Heard you folks might need some official presence out here." Judge Monroe, dismounting stiffly, added, "And legal clarity. I understand Sierra Land is making some rather bold claims. They say they've purchased the banknotes on several of these ranches," Grace explained. "They're demanding we turn over the properties immediately." The judge's weathered face creased in a grim smile. "Is that so? Well, as it happens, I've just come from the county recorder's office where no such transactions have been registered. And more importantly, I've received this by telegraph from the federal marshal in San Francisco." He handed Grace an official document, which she quickly scanned. "Sierra Land Company's assets have been frozen pending investigation of financial improprieties," she read aloud, hope rising in her voice. "All property transactions in the territories are suspended until further notice." The sheriff nodded. "Which means Barton and his men have no legal authority to be making demands or threats. I'm here to inform them of that fact and to escort them back to town or to jail, if they prefer." The confrontation that followed was tense but brief. Barton, faced with legitimate law enforcement and documented federal orders, had little choice but to withdraw, though his parting glare at Grace promised this wasn't the end. As Sierra Land's men rode away under the sheriff's watchful eye, the ranchers celebrated their unexpected reprieve. Judge Monroe remained behind to explain the full situation. "Thomas Harrington overextended himself," he told Grace and Zeke as they sat in the parlor. "Borrowed heavily against Sierra Land's assets to fund this campaign against the association, then couldn't cover his positions when several major investors pulled out. The company's effectively bankrupt." "Does that mean it's over?" Grace asked, hardly daring to hope. "This particular threat, yes," the judge confirmed. "The federal investigation will likely take months, during which Sierra Land can't operate in the territories. By the time it's resolved, if ever, your association will be firmly established with clear water rights and legal protections." Zeke shook his head in amazement. Edward would have loved to see this. "He had a hand in it, even from the grave," the judge said with a hint of satisfaction. "His documentation of Sierra Land's tactics formed the basis for the initial investigation." As word spread that the siege was over, the atmosphere at the Broken Spur transformed from tense vigilance to jubilant relief. The wagon of women and children was recalled, reuniting families by nightfall, and Mrs. Flores organized an impromptu celebration dinner for everyone who had stood together through the crisis. Late that evening, when the festivities had subsided and their guests had settled into their temporary quarters, Grace and Zeke walked alone in the starlit yard, savoring the peace that had seemed so uncertain just hours before. "We did it," Grace said softly, her breath misting in the cold December air. "We saved the Broken Spur, the association, everything Edward worked for." "We did," Zeke agreed, his arm slipping around her waist as they walked. "You did. Edward knew what he was doing when he chose you." Grace leaned into his warmth, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. "When I answered that advertisement in Boston, I never imagined any of this. I thought I was agreeing to a quiet arrangement, a dignified ending for a dying man and security for myself. And instead you got a war with Sierra Land and a bunch of stubborn ranchers to lead, Zeke said with a chuckle. And you, Grace added, turning to face him, her hands coming to rest on his chest. The most unexpected part of all. Zeke's eyes were warm as he gazed down at her. Regrets? Not one, she assured him, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss deepened, full of promise and possibility now that the shadow of Sierra Land no longer hung over them. When they finally broke apart, Zeke rested his forehead against hers. Spring still seems a long way off, he murmured, referring to their planned wedding. Grace smiled, her heart full. Perhaps we don't need to wait that long after all. Judge Monroe is still here. He could marry us tomorrow with all our friends already gathered. Surprise and joy flashed across Zeke's face. Are you sure? What about the wildflowers you wanted? I've learned that seizing happiness when it's offered is more important than perfect circumstances, Grace replied. Besides, we can always ride to the meadows in spring for a private celebration. The suggestion brought a deeper light to Zeke's eyes. Tomorrow, then, if you're certain. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Grace assured him. You? His answer was another kiss, this one sealing the promise of their future together. The wedding took place the following afternoon in the Broken Spur's main room, hastily decorated with evergreen boughs and ribbons by the women. Grace wore a blue dress Mrs. Flores had helped alter, with wildflowers Peterson's wife had somehow found despite the December chill. Zeke, in his best clothes with his hair freshly trimmed, watched her walk toward him with an expression of such unguarded love that tears pricked at Grace's eyes. Judge Monroe officiated with eloquent simplicity, speaking of partnerships forged in adversity and love that grew from respect and common purpose. When they exchanged vows and rings, Zeke had fashioned a simple gold band for himself to match her mother's ring. The room full of ranchers and hands who had fought alongside them erupted in cheers and applause. Mrs. Armstrong, Zeke whispered as he kissed her, making her new name a caress. Mr. Armstrong, she replied with a smile when they parted, partner in all things now. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music from an impromptu band of ranch hands who produced fiddles and harmonicas, dancing in the cleared main room, and enough food and drink to make everyone temporarily forget the tensions of the past weeks. As midnight approached, Grace and Zeke slipped away from the festivities to the private sanctuary of what was now their shared bedroom. The house had been tactfully vacated by their guests, who had moved to the bunkhouses for the night to give the newlyweds privacy. Later, as they lay entwined in the quiet darkness, Grace rested her head on Zeke's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Happy? He asked softly, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. Completely, she assured him. Though I'm still trying to comprehend how much my life has changed in 6 months. From a desperate woman answering a stranger's advertisement to the wife of the man I love and co-owner of one of the finest ranches in the territory. Zeke's arms tightened around her. You earned every bit of it, Grace. Your courage, your determination. You fought for this place as hard as any of us. We fought together, she corrected, raising her head to look at him in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. And we'll build its future together. Starting tomorrow, Zeke agreed, pulling her closer. Starting now, Grace whispered as she leaned down to kiss him, sealing their new beginning with love that had grown from the most unexpected of arrangements. Spring came to the eastern Sierra, with an explosion of wildflowers across the meadows and new life throughout the Broken Spur. The legal battles with Sierra Land concluded with a decisive victory for the Eastern Sierra Ranchers Association, as the federal investigation revealed widespread corruption and illegal tactics. The company was dissolved, its assets sold to satisfy creditors, and Thomas Harrington fled to Europe to escape prosecution. The dam that had threatened the valley's water supply was modified under court order to ensure equitable distribution to all ranches, and the association's legal standing was formally recognized by both county and territorial authorities. For Grace and Zeke, the changing season brought personal joy as well as professional success. Their partnership in marriage and in ranch management proved as effective as it was fulfilling. Under their joint leadership, the Broken Spur thrived, expanding its operations to include the horse breeding program Zeke had envisioned and innovative water conservation techniques Grace had researched. On a perfect May morning, when the meadows were at their most glorious, they rode together to the high pasture where they had once spied on Sierra Land's dam construction. Now the spot held different memories, as they spread a blanket among the wildflowers for a private celebration of their marriage and the future they were building. "I have something to tell you," Grace said as they sat side by side, looking out over the valley that had become their kingdom. "Something that will change our plans for the coming year." Zeke turned to her, curiosity in his eyes. "Good changes or concerning ones?" Grace took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "The most wonderful change imaginable. We'll be welcoming a new Armstrong to the Broken Spur around Thanksgiving." Joy and wonder transformed Zeke's face as the meaning of her words sank in. "A baby, you're sure?" Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. Grace nodded, her own happiness spilling over in her smile. "Our child will be born here, on the land we fought for, surrounded by the community we helped build." Zeke gathered her into his arms with a tenderness that made her heart swell. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for answering that advertisement, for staying when Edward asked, for fighting beside me, for loving me." "Always," Grace promised, knowing that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, she and Zeke and the child who would inherit not just the Broken Spur, but the legacy of courage and determination that had forged their unlikely family. As they rode back to the ranch that afternoon, Grace reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment of complete contentment. She had come west as a contract bride to a dying man, seeking only security and a fresh start. Instead, she had found purpose, community, love, and a home worth fighting for. Edward Harrington's final gift had been far greater than he could have imagined when he placed that advertisement in a Boston newspaper. By asking her to stay, and by entrusting Zeke to guide her, he had set in motion a story that would continue for generations, a legacy of love and determination that would shape the Eastern Sierra long after Sierra Land was forgotten. And as the Broken Spur came into view, with its sturdy buildings and grazing cattle, with ranch hands calling greetings and misses, Flores waving from the porch, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged beside Zeke, leading their community and carrying the next chapter of their story beneath her heart.